In the last video I made in this configuration, I spoke about Solidarity Trade Union and the members coming together with the larger community surrounding a town in the northwest called Stilfontein. Following the liquidation of a mine there and the resulting economic impact on the families who relied on the jobs which that mine provided. Oh, we're not done talking about Stilfontein, by the way, so keep an eye out. However, in that video, I promised to make a little follow-up video on Solidarity itself. Welcome to that video. Although, I'm sure as you can tell from the runtime, it ended up being not so little after all. Solidarity is, of course, a trade union, which means that their purpose is to protect the workers' rights of their members and to represent them in any of their employment interests. Solidarity's membership is mostly comprised of Afrikaners, which is somewhat in keeping with their goal to give a voice to minorities and the issues of their concern in South Africa. But their definition of what a minority is in South Africa is, well, it's interesting. Solidarity doesn't give a voice to Tsonga interests, or Venda interests, or even Ndebele interests, or any such cultural minorities, suggesting then that their definition of minority isn't one that's merely limited to culture, but it's one that actually extends to race. Minorities for Solidarity are mainly white Afrikaners and mostly some other non-black people. Pay attention to this, how they define words and concepts in accordance to how those words and concepts function in their larger rhetorical strategy. Afriforum, for instance, another body we might talk about at a different time, is an independent organization that is an outgrowth from Solidarity. And it functions as a civil rights organization, advocating for the rights of minority communities. And it seems to define these minority communities more or less along the same cultural and racial lines as Solidarity's definition. But enough background. Let's take a look at Solidarity in action and analyze their approach a little bit better using an actual real-life case study. The following is an interview with Solidarity CEO Mr. Dirk Hermann after the white members of his union, i.e. most of the membership of his union, decided to go on strike against the chemical and energy company Sasol because of their share ownership scheme, which was meant for black employees, of course specifically in the name of diversity and transformation. So let's see how Mr. Hermann handles the interview.
They're angry about a share ownership scheme offered exclusively to black staff. Sasol recently introduced their scheme, which also excludes foreign nationals. The ANC says it's concerned about the industrial action. Well, Solidarity Chief Executive Dirk Hermann joins us now. Good evening, sir. Thank you very much for your time. Happy with your day one of your industrial action at Sasol?
Yes, we are very happy with day one. Sasol is busy with a big shutdown process at this stage. So it's a big maintenance program. And our goal at this stage, we are technical workers. We know exactly how that shutdown processes work. And we want to delay that specific process. After day one, we heard 1.5 days behind schedule. We think that is putting a lot of pressure on Sasol. Our goal is not to cripple Sasol. Our goal is to bring them back to the negotiation table so that we can get a deal that can satisfy everyone.
Remember that, by the way, the point about delaying Sasol, not by denying it manpower or anything like that, but specifically by withholding certain technical skills. It will be important later. Well, much later, as in towards the end of the video. So at least you have the promise that this video will loop back and wrap up in a nice little bow.
Well, that's interesting that you're boasting about the fact that you are the technical people behind, Sasol, and it's a threat that you actually, proud that you're going to, bring them to a standstill.
Yes. Well, we are now in a power play mode. The fact of the matter is we try to resolve this through proper negotiation and mediation processes, and Sasol said no. So that means now at this stage that we are in a power play situation, and that is what the strike action actually are. The advantage of this is that we believe it's not necessary to go on too long because we think Sasol will come back to the negotiation table.
But do you not believe that apartheid's wrongs need to be corrected?
There's no ways that one can't believe that. So we are in fully agreement that one must do that. The question is how? I think Sasol simply goes too far. Sasol has the previous scheme, and the previous scheme in Inzalo was inclusive of all workers. Now they have a second scheme in Inzalo, Kanyisa, and Kanyisa is exclusive, so a future of exclusion. The mining charter that was just published in the government consent actually state very clear, if it comes to workers, ordinary workers, blue-collar workers, then it's about workers, and that is inclusive of all races. Even the empowerment charter that Sasol must obey to actually stipulates that.
I'll address the issue of the Kanyisa share ownership scheme being exclusive, as he says, but I'll do that after the interviewer also mentions this exclusivity. For now, though, I want to talk about the documents that Mr. Hermann references. The first is the mining charter, which he says was just published in the government gazette. The second is the empowerment charter, which he says Sasol must obey. He mentions these documents and then makes some important claims about them. Namely, that the mining charter states quite clearly that when it comes to, quote, workers, ordinary workers, blue-collar workers, then it's about workers, and it is inclusive of all races, unquote. And then he implies that the empowerment charter has the same criteria. So I would like us to look at these documents, if you will, to see if these claims actually hold up. I will post links to these documents in their entirety, of course, in the description down below. That way you can look at these documents yourself and perhaps let me know what I might have missed with what I'm about to show you. Let's first look at the mining charter that he said was just published in the government gazette. Now, this interview came out on the 3rd of September 2018. The document in question, which is actually the reviewed mining charter, I'll explain that later, it came out on the 15th of June that same year. So a mere few months earlier, which makes sense then that he would say it was just published in the government gazette. So I suspect we have the right document on our hands. And the very first item listed on the table of contents, after the preamble and the definitions and so on, item number 1 is/are the objectives of the mining charter. Now, I want us to look at just the first 3 of these objectives because despite the runtime, I truly am trying to make this video as short as I can. Quote, the mining charter seeks to achieve the following objectives. A. Recognize the internationally accepted right of the state to exercise sovereignty over all its mineral resources. B. Deracialize ownership of the mining industry by redressing the imbalances of past injustices. C. Substantially and meaningfully expand opportunities for black persons to enter the mining and minerals industry and to benefit from the exploitation of the nation's mineral resources. Unquote. Now, B and C seem to be in contradiction. Deracialize, but then also seek opportunities for black persons. But deracialize here means that a lot of industries and sectors were dominated by white people. And so it meant that whiteness was a strong factor in determining participation in these industries and in whatever role those industries played in the economy. But if people of different races were part of that industry and the economy as a whole, then race wouldn't play any important role in defining, determining, or characterizing how this economy plays out. So in order to do that, you have to include other people into these industries and into the economy. And so that's what they mean by deracialization. Once the economy is mixed up, then it's mixed. So you can't predict participation based on any one race. That's what they mean by deracialization. I might expand on that if I respond to the ANC's response to this solidarity interview. But for now though, this is a prime example of why when people quote references, you should jot them down and go and look for this stuff yourself later on. Because sometimes the people that reference them might be misinterpreting or perhaps misunderstanding them. So check those sources out yourself, including the ones that I mentioned in this video, by the way. Go into the description, check those sources out, and let me know what I might have missed or what I might have misunderstood. That way, like I often say, we keep one another in check. These are serious topics we're talking about, and no one here is infallible. So let us keep the standard of our conversation high by making sure that we are using the references that we quote responsibly. Just to drive this point home, though, I'll throw in one or two more items from the objectives of the Mining Charter. It says, quote, D, utilize and expand the existing skills base for the empowerment of black persons, unquote. Trust me, after you've watched the entirety of this video, you're going to want to watch it at least one more time. And I need you to pay attention to this quote as far as skills and empowerment are concerned for when you watch it the second time round. Oh, and by the way, the definition of black persons in this document is roughly as follows. Black persons is a generic term which means Africans, Coloureds, and Indians who are citizens of the Republic of South Africa by birth or descent. Anyway, the point that I hope I have made clear is that these passages do not suggest that when it comes to ordinary workers, there's some kind of exception to the rules and standards of transformation, let alone exceptions that are based on the allowance for all races without a particular focus on those that are/were historically and or presently excluded from the economy. I mean, point number E of the, just one more. Point number E of the objectives states, quote, advance employment and diversify the workforce to achieve competitiveness of the industry and productivity, unquote. Employment and the workforce are included in these objectives of the Mining Charter as pertains to transformation. But, hey, the objectives of the Mining Charter, even if they are listed as item number 1, only begin to appear on page 13, as indicated on the table of contents, or 17, as numbered on the document page itself. So maybe he didn't make it far enough into the document to read the first item. Happens to the best of us. In the event of that possibility, let us backtrack to earlier than the first item in the document, to maybe, let's say, just after the table of contents. This would be the preamble, okay? The very first thing you read after you read a list of what's going to be in the document. Very hard to miss. So what does this preamble say? Quote, the systematic marginalization of the majority of South Africans, facilitated by exclusionary policies of the apartheid regime, prevented black persons, as defined herein, from owning the means of production and from meaningful participation in the mainstream economy. Through its continued support and implementation of the discretionary policies and practices, the mining and minerals sector, which dominated the South African political and socio-economic order, brought about inequalities in the mining industry. To redress these inequalities and thus give effect to Section 9 Equality Clause of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa 1996, Act 108 of 1996 Constitution, the democratic government enacted inter alia the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002, blah blah blah. The primary objective of the Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act is to ensure the attainment of government objectives of redressing historical socio-economic inequalities and to ensure broad-based and meaningful participation of black persons in the mining and minerals industry. To this end, section blah 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 of this act empowers the minister to develop a broad-based black economic empowerment charter for the South African mining and minerals industry, the Mining Charter as a regulatory instrument to effect transformation by meeting specific targets within specified timeframes. Unquote. At the preamble, and things are already different from his characterization of this document. Oh, but wait, there's more. Quote, in 2009, the department conducted a comprehensive assessment to ascertain the progress of transformation in the mining industry against the objectives and agreed targets contained in the Mining Charter. The assessment revealed a number of shortcomings in the mining industry's implementation of the various elements of the Charter, vis-a-vis ownership, procurement, employment equity, in other words, the workers, ordinary workers, blue-collar workers, benefication, human resource development, mine community development, and housing and living conditions. To address these shortcomings, the Mining Charter was amended to streamline and expedite the attainment of its objectives. In addition to this, the amended Mining Charter introduced the sustainable development element, which sought to ensure sustainable transformation and growth of the mining industry. Unquote. Which, by the way, is another topic we have to address. Sustainable here doesn't mean the same thing, but we need to talk about sustainable development in the context of a just transition away from the fossil fuel industry. Anyway, that is the first document. You can read it yourself. It goes on and on like that. And again, if I missed something that you pick up on your reading of the document, let me know and I will correct this segment of the video. Among others, that is, specifically pertaining to this document. Like I said, no one is infallible. We just have to own up to it when we make mistakes. So now let's look at the second document, the Empowerment Charter
that Sasol must obey to.
Now, on this document, they don't use the term black persons. They use the term historically disadvantaged South Africans, or HDSA for short, which is a different term, but it means the same thing. If you are quick, you will realize that the very fact that I'm telling you this means that there is discussion of said group in this document as well, and discussion of it in relationship to transformation, obviously. Which means that Mr. Hermann's claim of this document having a criteria that includes demographics that are already largely included in the South African economy seems, from this vantage point at least, wrong. This is actually addressed, you guessed it, in the very first thing you read on the document. That is, the very first paragraph on the page, numbered 1. It reads, quote, in November 2000, the South African petroleum and liquid fuels industry stakeholders signed the Charter to provide a framework for driving the empowerment of historically disadvantaged South Africans, HDSA, in the liquid fuels industry, unquote. And as if that wasn't enough, a passage in the second paragraph states, quote, the signatories of the Charter, including Sasol Oil, are committed to facilitate empowerment in the industry by achieving targets as outlined in the Charter. A process is currently underway to align the Charter and triple BEE codes into the petroleum and liquid fuels sector codes, unquote. And as if that wasn't enough, they make it clear in point number 5 that they don't mean it merely at the ownership level, but that this extends to the level of workers, ordinary workers, blue-collar and white-collar workers. Because there, at point number 5, they break down the demographics of their inclusion targets across all levels of workers. That is, from senior management to unskilled workers. You can read it for yourself. And on point number 5, there's a passage there that says, quote, the focus remains on achieving our employment equity target to redress the underrepresentation of African females in senior management, colored Coloured, by the way, is not a derogatory term in South Africa. It's a separate ethnic group and cultural identity all on its own. So you might start getting used to hearing the term if you're going to be hanging around these parts. And African females in middle and junior management. Black people with disabilities represent 2.06% of all employees and continue to be a focus area across all levels. So, targets relating to employment equity and workers are also subject to the aims of transformation based on the inclusion of historically disadvantaged South Africans. Man, that's 0 for 2 for Mr. Hermann on the referenced document section. What's fout, Meneer Hermann? That's not a rhetorical question, by the way. If anybody can answer that, go ahead. But until then, let's get back to the arguments.
But then, I mean, an empowerment scheme, by definition, is going to exclude certain people.
Why? Why can't we have an empowerment scheme that empowers our black workers but does not exclude as well? Why can't we have an inclusive empowerment scheme like we've done at Anglo Gold, like we've done at different other companies in the mining industry? And that was a huge, huge success, because what happened then, you got commitment from all. So South Africa must find a balance between empowerment and inclusion. And that is what we ask for, and we are quite convinced one can do that. It's not necessary to do it like Sasol is doing it now. They did it in the previous scheme. They included all, and everyone was satisfied.
Not everyone was happy the first time, actually. That's part of the reason why the share scheme changed after all. But, as I promised earlier, first I want to address the interviewer's comment when he argued that an empowerment scheme, by definition, must exclude. I understand what he means to say in a colloquial sense. Nevertheless, I do think that he is phrasing the concept incorrectly in an important way. Important in the sense that his choice of words actually changes the material function that the scheme has in the larger South African economy. The scheme is not meant to exclude. It is meant to include previously and somewhat currently excluded people into greater participation in the South African economy. To define it by saying that it excludes is to look at it backwards, by not focusing on the people that the scheme is aimed at serving, and instead putting another group of people at the center of defining said scheme, and then determining its function based on its relation to this new group. It's like if you were making kids' shoes, as in shoes for kids, and then you had some people show up and started calling them not adult shoes. And then these people then going on to claim that their function is to discriminate against adults. When obviously these shoes need to be defined based on their target audience, the kids. And their function needs to be defined based on their inclusion of kids into the privileges of protective footwear. That's one point in this section that I wanted to address. The other point, which I touched on a little bit already, is made by Mr. Hermann himself, when he suggests that the previous scheme was great because it included, his definition of included, everyone. And he claims this was a great success because it got support from everyone and everyone was satisfied. But did the numbers related to that previous scheme, the Inzalo scheme, suggest that everyone was included? The actual definition of inclusion, and by extension that everybody was therefore satisfied? That is actually a very easy enough claim to investigate. To do that, let's go back to the year 2000. Don't worry, this will be a very short trip. This was the year when the mining charter in its original form first took effect. Right, from the year 2000, we are now going to travel all the way to the year 2009. Told you it would be a short stay. 2009 would be the first year that the mining charter was reviewed on its progress. Of course, in terms of the mining industry meeting the mining charter's objectives and targets up to that point. So, if you're with me so far, in 2000 was when the mining charter was first established. Then in 2009, the department conducted a review of how the industry had received the mining charter and its objectives. Now, do you care to hazard a guess as to what they found when they did this review? The department found that the industry had not met the transformation targets and objectives set for it by the mining charter of 2000. That is not a very clever guess though, actually, because I'm sure for one thing you can see what's going on around you in this country, but for another, we already quoted that piece earlier in the video. What this means though, in other words, is that not everybody was included by the industry now. Were they? Were we? And in fact, just as a side note here, there are plenty of indicators suggesting that within those intervening years, inequality between the comparative groups, that is, the previously disadvantaged and the previously advantaged groups, the inequality had actually increased in favor of the previously advantaged groups, suggesting that we might have to drop the whole previously adjectival qualifier to both the disadvantaged and advantaged groups, because those ostensibly previous dynamics still seem to be at play in a meaningful way insofar as participation in our economy is concerned. But, you know, that was 2009. Very far in the past. And as everybody knows, things became considerably better in our country and the world at large in the years after 2008, the year of the global financial crisis. The following period is otherwise known as the Zuma years. Not the game, the president. Wonderful. We kicked off the decade with the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, and famously, the 2010s went on to become just the best decade ever. No, of course not. Many things actually got worse in important ways. That year, 2009, was basically the first year in which the economy of the new South Africa stopped growing.
Since December 2008, our economy has not grown. So there's a link between
a trend that has remained stubbornly in place to this very day. Which means that even less and less people each year could even be included in mere participation within our economy, let alone ownership thereof. But you don't have to take my word for it. After 2009, they amended the mining charter. Again, as we already read earlier in the video. Then they did another review in 2014. This one reviewing the amended charter. And care to guess what this review found? Let's just say they had to amend the amendment, which led them to doing yet another review. This one released in June of 2018. That's the one Mr. Hermann is talking about when he references the mining charter that was just released in the government gazette.
The mining charter that was just published in the government gazette.
Yet there he is misrepresenting or perhaps misunderstanding the supposed inclusion that the previous share schemes had and their failure to meet the objectives that were set in the previous mining charter that then was reviewed, and this was stated in 2018. The very document that he's referencing suggests that the schemes from previous times, the Inzalo scheme for instance, that Sasol had previously, did not help the industry meet the targets and objectives of the mining charter as pertains to transformation, not just in ownership, but employment equity, mining, help and housing, and all these things. That whole list that we read through earlier. All of it. Those didn't help them meet the objectives in any of it. That's why the 2018 reviewed mining charter document exists. Because review after amendment after amendment of the mining charter found that the industry was not nearly as inclusive as it had signed on to be. And the very fact that black workers welcomed this new share scheme from Sasol should have given Mr. Hermann some clue that not everybody was satisfied with how things were with previous schemes. It is evidence contrary to his belief that everybody was included and satisfied back in the good old days.
But I mean, from your engagements with Sasol, what have they said their reasons for doing it this way this time around?
There's actually only one reason, and they want to list this specific scheme on what they call the JSE Empowerment Index. And on the Empowerment Index, only black can trade with black. And now they can't have the whites within the scheme because black can only trade with black. But the problem with that is you are watering down the share value of your black employees as well. So they exclude the white employees, they estrange them, and they're watering down the shares of the black employees.
How so, though?
Because you have a very limited place where you can trade. You can't trade on the open market. You can only trade in that specific segment, and that limits their share value. So at the end of the day, Sasol has its scorecard. They are satisfied. In 10 years' time, they are okay. But I think black workers and white workers, because they are excluded, pay the price for Sasol empowerment point. It's a commercial motivation of them, not a moral motivation.
Wonderful. Okay. I'm taking notes. And you should be taking notes of this argument as well. By the way, did you hear that? It's a move that's going to be commercially good for Sasol, and yet bad for its shareholders. Commercially good for Sasol, which will be bad for its shareholders. A company makes moves that are beneficial commercially, that is bad news for its share. Okay, look, I understand that he's making an argument about not trading on the quote-unquote open market. And he's trying to steer people away from the idea that Sasol is operating on moral convictions to try and redress injustices of the past. And if that's off the table, then their only other motivation must be commercial interest. The thing is, though, that is a poor argument to make if it's going to be part of a larger point about how Sasol is actually hurting its shareholders. Hurting shareholders is not in your commercial interests. Typically, in fact, it's a sign of commercial decline, which coincidentally is an argument you can make about Sasol and Inzalo, their previous share scheme. So Mr. Hermann needs to decide which one it is. Are they helping or are they hurting themselves commercially? Because as things stand, he seems to be saying they are pursuing commercial interests when he's making one point of his argument and then saying they are hurting themselves when he is pursuing another point. He needs a better grasp of the logical object permanence of each of the points that he's making within his larger rhetorical strategy.
But then, I mean, if the black workers and Sasol are prepared to, bite the bullet, so to speak, because they believe in the correctness of what they are doing, what gives you the right to decide for them what's good for them?
No, I don't decide for them. We don't strike on behalf of the black members that have a limited place where they can trade.
But that's what you're presenting as your argument. But it's going to erode value. But the people affected, directly affected, who've made the decision, and those who are going to be at the receiving end of this transaction are happy with it.
It's their responsibility to take it up with Sasol.
So why then would you, make that argument on their behalf?
Not on their behalf, but that is what's gonna happen. What we stand up for this at this stage is ordinary blue-collar guys that feel excluded. And now we can argue to this side and to that side. These people, 89% of your members voted in favor of a strike. They are frustrated and they want the world to hear that. They want the world to hear that, listen, we have a frustration.
This section, this is really the most telling section of the entire interview. Don't worry now, there are more dramatic revelations yet to come. But this is one of the more pivotal moments in the interview where Meneer Hermann shows his hand. When he confesses, essentially, that he is not representing black workers or their interests in this strike. Now, to be fair, the reason why he said that is because he didn't want to seem to be talking over black people about what they're supposed to want or whatever. The interviewer made it seem as though Meneer Hermann was being condescending to black workers by presuming to know what's in their best interests better than them. So I understand that he was trying to get away from that charge. But in doing so, he inadvertently admitted the usually unspoken part of Solidarity's main concerns. If you remember earlier in the video, we spoke briefly about how Solidarity defines a minority. It's not just based on culture, because there are a number of cultural minorities whose workers' interests Solidarity does not represent. So their definition has a sort of intersection with race. This moment is when all of that becomes abundantly apparent. I mean, more than was already the case before for the initiated. They admittedly are not here to represent the interests of black workers. They are here to mainly represent the interests of white workers. And yet they do this while rejecting accusations of racism, as they, in fact, deflect such accusations onto Sasol and the ANC instead.
And I think, for instance, the ANC, as government party, must listen to that. The ANC doesn't do that. They say, no, you are a bunch of racists. They mustn't do that. They must say, let's listen to your frustrations and let's seek a solution for all. The ANC says, Solidarity, you are the racists. That's not us that exclude people simply because of the color of the skin.
And this tactic becomes completely exposed for what it is when he argues, albeit in more sophisticated terms, that, look, some of my best friends are black.
Solidarity has black members as well. Our black members feel just as strong. In fact, our black colleagues, that's not even members of Solidarity, also say this is about right and wrong, not necessarily about black and white.
Which is a classic racist tactic. And you, watching this right now, you, my dear intrepid viewer, you know that that is the case. Even if you are on Solidarity's side in general, like you're on their side of the issue, but you disagree with some of their tactics. If that describes you, then you know what this is. You know that that argument strategy is a classic racist deflection in order to try and shield oneself from a charge against racism. Because, I mean, imagine if the ANC did the same thing. Imagine if they said, we also have white colleagues that are or are not members of the organization. We also have certain connections with white businessmen or white what have you, who also believe that our policies are not about black or white, but they are about redressing the injustices of the past, which led to the continued exclusion of black persons, as herein defined, from participation in the South African economy. Would you, or rather let me put it differently, do you honestly believe that Solidarity would go, oh, okay, well, I mean, if you have some white people you're talking to that say this is okay, well then I guess it's not racially based at all anymore. We were wrong. It's not a racially exclusionary scheme after all. Of course not. They'd sooner argue that those people had some sort of white guilt or whatever before they gave away that argument and said, yeah, we were wrong. Bottom line is they would still be arguing against this share scheme on the basis of it being racially exclusionary by their definition. And if you say, well, the ANC hasn't made that argument, so really we're just dealing in the realm of hypothetical... Hold that thought.
Well, let's go back to our conversation on Solidarity members who are at Sasol, who are currently striking. They're angry about a share ownership scheme offered exclusively to black staff. ANC spokesperson Pule Mabe joins us now.
I mean, this is actually to undermine the many progressive Africans and many progressive whites who are there at Sasol. Because there are a lot of white people who do not think the way that Solidarity thinks. There are many others who believe that building this magic country and making this country of Nelson Mandela better requires us to work together. We can't have people making such racial statements in 2018. It's not in keeping with our own democracy.
It's the exact same argument. The exact same self-defense. There's no way it can be transparent and obvious when your ideological opponents do it, but not when your comrades do it. If that is not enough of a shield for the ANC, then it's not enough of a shield for Solidarity either, and vice versa. The charge remains because, to further extend the shoe metaphor I have already extended in this video, if the racist shoe fits, then they must wear it. You see, the the back and forth around race in this country has been dominated by people who, on either side, will lay the charge of racism against their opponents. Meanwhile, the rest of us, I'd say more sensible people, are sitting there thinking, hang on, both of you are actually correct, in that both of you have managed to convince me of each other's racism. I'm not saying that the charge applies to all participants equally. If South Africa has one theme, it's inequality. However, the distribution of that condemnation is less interesting to me, at this point anyway, than the mere admission that the charge applies to all major factions involved in this racial discourse. And if you're not convinced yet, then don't worry, because I'm about to make this point even clearer for you for the remainder of this video. And to get deeper into that point, I want to address some of the comments that Meneer Hermann makes, specifically on the subject of racial tension.
But Sasol, it would seem, you saying that you've engaged with them, but they are not backing off. So it means that they have listened to what you have to say, but they simply disagree with you.
Yes.
Why don't you accept that?
We will not accept that because it's not morally justifiable to exclude a specific part of your employees on grounds of race. Because in practice, what will happen? There will be a guy that works for 40 years at Sasol, loyal for 40 years. But then will be a guy that worked there for 3 weeks. The guy that's there for 3 weeks will get share value of 500,000 rand. The guy that's there for 40 years never was part of a share scheme because he's an ordinary blue-collar guy. He gets nothing. That will lead to racial tension. This whole Sasol decision brought about racial tension, and the only reason why they did it was for commercial empowerment points. I don't see the moral reasoning behind Sasol.
The Sasol scheme can be said to bring about racial tensions if that's all you are considering, with the assistance of blinders at the flanks of your temples. However, in the larger scheme of things, Sasol's decision didn't bring about racial tension. Their decision is actually a product of racial tension. That is why the original mining charter had to be amended time and time again. Because none of the objectives to substantively include black persons, as defined therein, in South Africa's economy, at least as far as this particular industry is concerned, none of those objectives, I repeat, none, were ever met. That is racial tension. The inequalities between white and black persons have continued on into the new South Africa. And where you might or can argue that it has gotten worse, that has happened to the disadvantage of already previously disadvantaged South Africans. That is racial tension, not the clumsy schemes that are products of, or might even be said to be responding to, the racial tension. You see, Solidarity may cast themselves as the ones that are responding to racial tensions. They may carry themselves like they exist as a pushback against affirmative action and triple BEE. But that's not the case. Or at least it's not the whole story. Solidarity Trade Union is over 100 years old. They existed before a democratic South Africa was even a speck of possibility on the cosmic dust of time, let alone affirmative action. They already had the mandate of their vision and mission long before BEE was even a glint in the imagination of white businessmen who were desperate to hold on to their wealth when it seemed inevitable that Nelson Mandela would become president. Way back then, Solidarity had an exclusionary policy against black persons and mainly represented the interests of white Afrikaner workers. Unlike post-apartheid, where today they mainly represent the interests of... Hey, hang on just a minute! Look, Solidarity is not a response or a remedy to racial tensions caused by affirmative action. They are what they have always been, long before affirmative action came along. They still have largely the same constituency, they still fight for the interests of largely the same group, and all of that is being done towards largely the same ends. That is why their demographic focus has not changed in over 100 years. No matter the political climate, be it before, during, or after apartheid, it doesn't matter. All that changes is the rhetoric they use, the arguments they make, which are just instruments to nevertheless represent the same interests towards the same ends. Despite all the colors, I'm not trying to impersonate a parrot here. I'm repeating this for emphasis. That's why they define words like minority based on expediency. Same with exclusion. These are just interchangeable tools to them to help them fight the same fight that they have been fighting for over a century. They simply adjust these tools in accordance to specifications that are better suited for the current political arena. And that community, that minority of interest, is for them white Afrikaner workers. As such, Solidarity is not a remedy to racial tensions incited by others. From its very formation, Solidarity Trade Union was established in part as the organizational incitement of racial tensions. So they are not going to help us fix them. What do you mean by that, you might ask me? After all, they say they want to help us fix, perhaps even prevent racial tensions. I know you're a wizard, Mr. X, but are you a mind reader as well? Okay, just let me explain myself. Look at the criticism they have of this Sasol share scheme, and then look at how they formulate their solution to the problem. The criticism they have of this scheme is that it is a race-based correction to a race-based error. And their argument is that you cannot fix race-based errors with race-based corrections. Whether you agree with them or not, that is their criticism of the exclusionary aspect of Sasol's Khanyisa share ownership scheme. But then, how do they formulate their solution to the race-based problems of their Khanyisa share scheme? By organizing themselves into a race-based formation around white Afrikaner workers. That's not even hypocritical. That is flat out contradictory. Because how can they denounce Sasol's race-based solution to their race-based problem of the economic exclusion of black persons in their industry if, when Solidarity is given an opportunity to show how to properly respond to this problem, they also organize on a racial basis? That is the exact same strategy as the one you are denouncing when it is being performed by others. And it's for the same reasons, albeit at a smaller scale and with a different color. And remember, that's if I'm being charitable and humoring the notion that Solidarity is a corrective to certain affirmative action and or black economic empowerment policies, when in actuality, like I already said, they have been doing this for a long time. Meanwhile, the mining charter was only established in the year 2000. That seems like a long time from now, but in comparison, it's nothing. Their interest in specifically white Afrikaner workers is old, and it has remained since their conception. That, Meneer Hermann, is racial tension. Then there's this scenario that he sets up about a person who has worked for Sasol for 40 years and another who has worked only for 3 weeks. I do hope you can already tell what has gone wrong with this hypothetical, based on his own arguments and the information he himself has already provided. But if you haven't picked up on it yet, don't worry, I got you. Earlier in the video, Mr. Hermann introduced the audience to a previous Sasol share scheme called Inzalo, which he said was better because it included everyone, which is true, if you correct for his use of the terms inclusion and exclusion, respectively. But here,
there will be a guy that works for 40 years at Sasol, loyal for 40 years. But then there will be a guy that worked there for 3 weeks. The guy that's there for 3 weeks will get share value of 500,000 rand. The guy that there for 40 years never was part of a share scheme because he's an ordinary blue-collar guy. He gets nothing.
He's talking about a white employee who has been working at Sasol for 40 years and yet has never had a share scheme applied to them? Which is it?
Sasol has the previous scheme, and the previous scheme in Inzalo was inclusive of all workers.
Did Sasol have a previous share scheme called Inzalo, which included everyone, and is therefore the precedent upon which he is basing his criticism of the new exclusionary Khanyisa share scheme?
Now they have a second scheme in Inzalo, Khanyisa, and Khanyisa is exclusive, so a future of exclusion.
Or has there never been a share scheme that white workers could participate in the past 40 years? He has to pick one or the other. And until then, he doesn't have any entitlement to anyone's attention for the rest of his confused argument, as well as its resulting and potentially foggy hypothetical. By the way, if this white Afrikaner worker had been working for Sasol for 40 years, when exactly does that mean they got their job? What year is 40 years before 2018? That would be 1978. Now, what was going on in 1978? Could there have been something that might have privileged white Afrikaner workers, and thus might be part of the reason why they were included in this industry when perhaps others might not have been? What was it? 1978. I remember we were taught about it in school. Well, I can't remember it. Must not have been all that important then. Next point.
The people who have been at the receiving end of apartheid's effects for hundreds of years also do not see the moral of that story, but they have had to live with the fact that there is a way in which to do these things. They are not happy. No black person is happy with the pace of transformation, but they have had to abide by the rules. They have had to listen to the arguments that are being made precisely to avoid the conflict that you're talking about.
That's exactly what I said.
Yeah, I hope that we tackle it in another way in the democracy of South Africa.
What way? What way? Please tell us how, sir. Please. We're waiting. We want the solution to this. Tell us how.
The fact of the matter is, Sasol has an aggressive affirmative action program. They have aggressive training and development programs for black youth. There's aggressive programs for redress. And even this program, we don't say don't empower your black workers. What we say is don't exclude. Can't we find a way where we include everyone? Why do we think, per definition, must we exclude?
This is a wonderfully enticing point to unpack. Because here we have Mr. Hermann, who has been suggesting how immoral it is to have race-based policies that, in his view, exclude white people. Yet now, when he talks about what else can be done to correct injustices of the past, apart from a share scheme like this, he talks about aggressive affirmative action policies that Sasol has to equip young black South Africans with skills.
Workers, ordinary workers, blue-collar workers. Then it's about workers, and that is inclusive of all races.
Something that is also race-based, right? But that's okay, so long as there isn't a race-based share ownership scheme. So, but hang on, there are young white people that are excluded by that skills program, right? So what about them? Does Solidarity not think that they are deserving of justice? Hey, this is what I've been trying to tell you, okay? Young, black, white, colored, Asian, Indian, South Africans, none of these old people care about you. I mean, of course, some of them, blah, blah, blah. There are nuances to that statement, but just take the spirit of what I'm saying, okay? None of them care about you. They say that they are doing what they are doing for you, for their future, embodied in you, but they will throw you under the bus for their own immediate benefits and against their own ideology. But they will do that the very first chance they get. So, hey, maybe sometimes as young South Africans, we need to talk amongst ourselves without adult supervision. Just think about that, yeah? And get back to me. I'll wait. There's another point here that takes us back to the argument that Mr. Hermann made at the beginning of the video. Remember when I told you to take note of the argument he made when he talked about being in a power play mode? The argument was about how their members, who are mostly white, are the ones with certain technical skills, and that's what they were going to leverage against Sasol.
Sasol is busy with a big shutdown process at this stage. So it's a big maintenance program. And our goal at this stage, we are technical workers. We know exactly how that shutdown processes work. And we want to delay that specific process. After day one, we heard 1.5 days behind schedule. We think that is putting a lot of pressure on Sasol. Our goal is not to cripple Sasol. Our goal is to bring them back to the negotiation table so that we can get a deal that can satisfy everyone.
Well, that's interesting that you're boasting about the fact that you are the technical people behind, Sasol, and it's a threat that you actually, proud that you're going to, bring them to a standstill.
Yes. Well, we are now in a power play mode. The fact of the matter is we try to resolve this through proper negotiation and mediation processes, and Sasol said no. So that means now at this stage that we are in a power play situation, and that is what strike action actually are.
So, if no one else possesses these certain skills apart from a specific racial group, to the degree that they can mobilize industrial action based on solidarity within their racial background, then that means Sasol's supposedly aggressive affirmative action policies in terms of skills development didn't even make a dent in the attempt to de-racialize those particular skill sets. And the evidence that backs this up was given by Mr. Hermann himself when he said that Sasol was delayed by their admitted power play. More than that, the fact that the mining charter had to be amended again and again is further evidence that these skills development programs weren't aggressive. BEE aggressive. BEE aggressive. Because, as stated earlier, none of their transformation objectives were ever met. Improvements were made, that's for sure, but the main objectives were never actually satisfied. So, his own alternatives to the scheme here have already shown themselves to be failures, which means that taking the industry back there will only reproduce the conditions that necessitated the amendment to the mining charter in the first, second, third, fourth place, etc. Namely, the condition of inequality, which, as far as race is concerned, tended to be, and mostly still tends to be, in favor of the previously advantaged. Now, that's just one metric, of course. There are also others like gender, disability, or even intra-racial comparisons, meaning within races instead of one race compared to another, and other things like that. But this is just the metric that they are discussing in this interview, so there. All right, so are there any more arguments before I make my closing remarks?
On a related, but not so much an aside, but do you not think that there's even a compelling argument to be made here, or to be maybe a lesson to be learned from what you told me this evening, that because you are so in charge in the technical, or your members rather, in the technical division of Sasol, you have that capacity and ability to actually hold the organization to ransom. And that's the argument people have been making, for transformation, that no area of any company's work should fall entirely, in the hands of a particular group of people that can use it, against the company. Do you not think that it actually strengthens the argument? In other words, what you just said today strengthens the argument for transformation.
We are actually only 20% of those specific category of workers. 80% of those category are at this stage black workers.
Nope. No more arguments, just more of the same. Look, just saying a statistic without breaking it down in connection to the question at hand doesn't do anything for anybody. There being 80% black people in his particular sector on its own is quantitative transformation, which simply means that, yeah, more black people are working there. But that's just one metric. So congratulations, Mr. Hermann. You've just handed the governing party... okay. I mean, but hey. The governing party, their next campaign point to mislead the rest of the nation about their supposed progress. That is, of course, before they have to make amendments to their own progress time and time again. Anyway, according to the mining charter, which Sasol must obey, there are more metrics that encompass transformation. This includes skills transformation. So yeah, there could be 80% black workers, which, as I said, is quantitative transformation. But if they don't possess the requisite skills that allow white solidarity members to strong-arm Sasol, then there's only been transformation on the register, but not on the matter of transferring critical technical skills in the industry. Mr. Hermann himself mentioned that Sasol's aggressive affirmative action policy when it comes to skills applies to young black workers. In other words, most likely the inexperienced, which means that they aren't part of the conversation so far as skills are concerned, beyond the fact that they are being trained. They don't possess them yet. This many years after 1994, and our demographic is still trying to get these things. We are still in the process.
Well, the fact of the matter is, transformation took place there to a large extent. It's not exclusively for white workers, that specific technical areas and areas for artisans. That's actually an area that's already quite widely transformed in the company.
Meanwhile, Mr. Hermann was talking about how some of his workers might have been loyal Sasol employees for 40 years. They have had these skills. So do not be fooled by the ANC's largely quantitative transformation, Mynheer Hermann. That sort of thing is only about 1/3 of the transformation fight. The rest is qualitative transformation, which means skills and ownership. And at least that last one is where the share scheme comes in. And it's rather interesting that it's with this that Mynheer Hermann shows his true colors. Or, I guess, the lack thereof. Because he was comparatively silent when it came to the race-based transformation on other metrics. But when it comes to ownership, that's when he brings the fight. And bring the fight they do. Solidarity Trade Union has done some solid work recently for its members. They sued the state arms manufacturing company Denel for unpaid salaries and other payments on behalf of their members. And the Johannesburg Labour Court ordered the company to pay up 90 million rand. That was in February of this year. And all of that is even more intriguing if you consider the fact that they seized 12 million rands worth of property from the same company last year over similar shenanigans against their employees. Good on them for getting their members paid in this whole debacle after some of them hadn't received a full salary since May of 2020. There's also a charity that is an offshoot of their organization. It's mainly meant for the assistance of white Afrikaners, so there's that. But hey, it's a charity. I mention these things to say that Solidariteit has genuinely affected some people's lives for the better, if you were to ask them. So in demonstrating why they are flawed in their outlook and in the larger role they play in the South African labor landscape, very much from their conception up until this very day, with some exceptions along the way, and we'll get to that in a minute. But in doing that, we have to be careful to tackle the arguments directly and to do so comprehensively. It may be boring and tiring to go step by step and unravel this worldview, but it's a small and yet important part of what we need to do to reach communities that think about their charity, for instance, when they hear the word Solidariteit, or that see some of their victories against the government, for another instance. So we have to come correct in our criticism and actually make a case that any level-headed person can easily understand and sign up to. To that end, I want to invite you to read the documents that are mentioned here yourself. If perhaps I found the wrong documents, you can email me links to the correct documents. My email will be in the description down below. Let us help each other keep this platform valuable so that all the hours we're putting into this project can have qualitative, not just quantitative worth. If Solidarity truly wants to be about inclusion for everyone, they can be. They can have a diverse membership that advocates for the interests of everybody at work. They can be the inclusive example they want to see in the world, collaborating with different people of different backgrounds across the country to fight against the machine by means of true unionism. And actually, you know what? They've done it before. If you really want the good old days, let's go back to Stilfontein 2005, when Solidarity members came together with the surrounding community to share a food scheme in order to maintain some semblance of dignity for the workers and their families who were affected by the liquidation of a mine. And in all of them standing together, they were able to attract the attention of the nation in a way none of them ever could have done if they were apart. That, Meneer Hermann, is true unionism and true inclusion. Isolated, we beg. Together, we bargain. And you search Solidarity, this shows up. And it's a message that says this article may have been created or edited in return for undisclosed payments, a violation of Wikipedia's terms of use. It may require cleanup to comply with Wikipedia's content policies, particularly neutral point of view. Propaganda.